had been raining for most of the day. Yesterday's forecast was for a light shower, but this was torrential. I peeked out of the window, and in the darkness of the late afternoon, I could see a river of rainwater cascading down either side of the street. My parents were getting worried about my sister. Emily had spent the day at a friend's house and was supposed to be back an hour ago. But just as my dad was about to get in his car and go for a drive around the block to find her, the front door opened. Emily walked in, dressed in her yellow raincoat. Much to my parents' chagrin, she was holding onto the worn collar of an old, soaking wet dog. The thing was a mongrel, but I could make out the Alsatian in it. Maybe some golden retriever. As I tried to work it out, I made a mental note to put dog breeder down on my list of career interests for school. My parents exchanged apprehensive glances as Emily smiled awkwardly and explained how she found him shivering in the rain on the side of the road. There was something about its eyes, she said, that made her instantly feel sorry for the poor guy. My dad knelt by the dog and had a look at its collar. It was battered, its red color fading, and it had no name, phone number, or address written on it. My father stood up with a sigh and told Emily that he'd bring the mutt to the vet on Thursday to see if it had been chipped. And for the 5 days until then, looking after it would be her responsibility. Emily beamed at my dad and took the dog into the kitchen to towel it down. Later on that evening, she brought it back into the living room and informed us that his name was Buster. My dad warned against getting too attached, but she didn't listen. She spent the rest of the day playing with Buster and sending pictures of him to her friends. That night, Buster slept on a makeshift bed of old blankets and cardboard in the kitchen. My parents prayed that he wouldn't make a mess of the place at night. Emily hugged Buster and gave him another treat before rushing off to her room. In the morning, all was well. It looked like Buster hadn't moved an inch. The dopey guy barely looked up at us when we crowded into the kitchen for breakfast. Immediately, Emily knelt beside him, rubbing his tummy and stroking his fur. I think Emily was too afraid of taking Buster for a walk, just in case she bumped into his owners and they dragged him away from her. The garden had been turned into mud the day before, and there wasn't a chance in hell that my mother would let that dog back in the house if he had a trace of mud on his paws. So he, like the rest of us, spent that day cooped up inside. Not that he seemed to mind. My dad cooked up a lamb chop for Buster that night, at Emily's request. It was the most animated I've seen him. His eyes lit up as we placed it in front of him, and we all erupted into laughter as he tore into it. That night, I jolted awake. The radio alarm clock on my bedside cabinet informed me, in analog red light, that it was 4:37. I lay there, but quickly began to fall back asleep. As I was, I could have sworn I heard something moving around in the hallway. I assumed it was my dad, stumbling to the bathroom in a drunken stupor, and for the second time that night, sleep took me. I spent most of the next day hanging out with friends around town. We rode our bikes, threw stones at the windows of the old house on Mill Street, and dared each other to go shoplift from the local off-brand gas station. I made off with a packet of apple-flavored chewing gum. When I came home, things felt different, hostile. I didn't want to ask what had happened, but before I could slink off to my room, my mother told me. Emily had accidentally knocked over my grandfather's urn while playing with Buster in the front room. I suppressed a chuckle at the thought of how much trouble she'd be getting in. Mature of me, I know. That evening, there was silence around the dinner table, broken only by Buster's whining. I woke up again that night. This time, I swung myself out of bed. My mouth was dry, and my breath left a stale taste at the back of my throat. I wandered downstairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I tried to be as silent as possible, not wanting to disturb the sleeping dog. Buster slept soundly in his little bed, and I knew a freight train going past wouldn't wake him. I poured a glass of water and drank it in a continuous gulp. Then, an idea came to me. I crouched by the cabinet where my dad kept his whiskey. I opened it, trying not to let the hinges creak. I picked out a bottle and stood up. I gently unscrewed the cap and took a sip. I coughed and choked and spluttered, and as I went for another sip, I heard movement upstairs. I knew my father would kill me if he caught me drinking. I hastily put the cap back on and placed it back in the cupboard. I speed walked out of the kitchen, desperate not to make a noise. Just before I began ascending the stairs, I heard the door to my parents' room open. I quickly turned around and hid in the living room. I heard my father walk down the stairs and into the kitchen. My heart was beating like a tribal drum as I hurried out of the living room, and I stepped agonizingly loudly up each creaky step back to my bedroom. I thought I had made it, but just as I was pushing my bedroom door open, I heard a voice behind me. It was my father. He'd popped his head out of his bedroom. He asked me if I was moving around. I told him that I'd just gone downstairs to get a glass of water. He told me to keep it down, and before he retreated back into the darkness of his room, I saw my mother stirring in the bed behind him. He closed the door. That morning, I woke up with a migraine. Nothing too major, but it was a drawback from what would have otherwise been a great day. My sister was at some dance club, my mother was visiting the solicitor in town, and my father had gone golfing. On this rare occasion, I had the house to myself. Well, me and the dog. I found a strongly worded note on the kitchen table when I woke up. It was left by Emily, telling me how I should feed and entertain Buster while she was gone. I crumpled it up and attempted to throw it into the bin from across the room, missing horribly. I made myself the unhealthiest breakfast I could think of, and I took it into the living room to eat it while I settled down to watch a film, Dan O'Bannon's Return of the Living Dead. That's how I spent the morning. Later on, I took my empty plate into the kitchen. I figured if my mother saw that I cleaned the dishes, she wouldn't be as critical when she found the crumbs. I walked past Buster, who was slumped in his usual stop on the corner of the room, on a bed of now dirty sheets. In a joking manner, I asked him how his day was while I washed up. Obviously, I got no reply. I remembered my sister's note and set a half-dried glass down while I fetched Buster some treats. I didn't know where Emily kept them, so I grabbed a slice of overly processed ham from the fridge. I crouched beside him and dangled it in front of his snout, teasing him. There was no response. No slow opening of the eyelids, no methodic wag of the tail. There were no signs of life at all. I gasped and put my hand on his stomach, trying to feel it rise with his breath, or a heartbeat or anything. To my horror, his abdomen began to compress when I did, like a limp, deflating balloon. He felt hollow, empty. I scrambled to my feet and stumbled backwards, and as I put my hand on the counter, I knocked over a glass, and it shattered on the kitchen floor, but Buster didn't so much as flinch. I panicked and ran up to my room. I took my phone from my bedside cabinet and hastily rang my mother. It rang for a brief moment before she picked up. I managed to stutter out there was something wrong with the dog and that it was an emergency. She assured me that she had just picked up Emily and would be home in 10 minutes. And with that, she hung up. I set my phone down and paced around the room. As I was thinking, I heard a noise coming from the first floor. It sounded like someone was moving around, and I assumed it was my mother, home earlier than she estimated. I made my way downstairs to greet her, hurrying over the creaking steps. But there was no one. The door was still locked, and I, as far as I knew, was alone in the house. I heard the now familiar wag of Buster's tail as he came bounding up to me from the hall. I looked at him, puzzled, as he nestled his head into my leg. I stroked him behind his ears as he mewled low. I then heard the equally familiar jangling of keys as the front door was unlocked. My mother stepped inside, pumping her umbrella. Emily, who was close behind her, ran to Buster and dropped to her knees as soon as she saw him. She hugged him tight and whispered in his flea-bitten ear. I could see her eyes were red, raw from crying. My mother asked me what the big emergency was, and I paused before answering. I explained that he had been unresponsive, but he seems fine now. My mother let out a long, drawn-out sigh as she made her way past us and into the kitchen. She called my name, frustrated when she saw the broken shards of glass on the kitchen floor. I had forgotten about that. Emily spent the rest of the day in her room with the dog. At dinner, neither me or my mother mentioned anything about Buster's false alarm. We just let my dad witter on about improving his backswing, whatever that meant. For the third night in a row, I jolted awake in the small hours of the morning. I groaned at the abrupt ending of a good dream, tossing and turning until I found a comfy position. And as I tried to get back to sleep, I began to feel a presence. It was the feeling you get during an awkward silence, when you become painfully aware of the other person. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes, trying to adjust them to the darkness. There was someone in the corner of my room. I was certain of it. I could make out the vague shadow-covered silhouette standing just beyond the foot of my bed. I was almost paralyzed with fear, but my right hand managed to creep over to my bedside cabinet. I fumbled as I felt for the familiar switch of the lamp. Just before I turned it on, the figure in my room bolted. I recoiled in shock as I realized that my half-asleep mind had been right. Someone had been standing right there, watching. As the moon emerged from a bank of clouds, my room was briefly lit with a dull glow, and in that half-light I saw the outline of a tall, thin man slink out of my room and into the darkness of the hall. I didn't realize I was screaming until my father burst into my room moments later. He switched on the lights, which burned my eyes. He held me and asked what was wrong. With snot and tears dripping down my face, I managed to stutter out that there had been someone in my room. At this, my dad turned and ran back into his room. His caring embrace was quickly replaced by my mother's. He emerged with a baseball bat in his hands, grasping it so hard his knuckles were white. My mother went to check on Emily. She made me come with her, not wanting to let her children out of her sight. Me barging into Emily's room. She was already awake, sitting upright in bed. My mother fired a barrage of questions at her. Dazed, Emily told us that she hadn't seen anything. My father came into the room 10 minutes later. He informed us that he did a sweep of the house and found nothing. No signs of a break-in, no mysterious intruder. He brought me back to my room. Once I was in bed, he sat by my side and explained to me that I probably just had a bad dream. He said there was nothing to be afraid of and joked that if someone did break into the house, they'd soon be scared off by Buster, the world's greatest guard dog. Eventually, I mustered the courage to fall back asleep. The next morning, everyone in the family was noticeably tired, even the dog. We greeted each other with yawns and joked about the previous night's events. I didn't know that this was the start of the last truly happy day of my life. My parents went out shopping. Emily took Buster for his first proper walk, and I spent most of the day gaming. It was a normal day. I've had dozens just like it. We had chicken breasts and bland steamed vegetables for dinner. Wednesday was family night, so after dinner we came together in the living room to play a board game. Tonight was Cluedo. Buster was curled up at Emily's feet. My father thought then was a good time to remind her that tomorrow he was bringing the dog to the vet and would hopefully reunite him with his real owners. At this, Emily screamed that she was his real owner. She stormed out of the room, Buster following closely behind. As soon as she slammed the door behind her, my dad sighed. He said he knew my sister would get too attached to that dog. This was a sour note that the day ended on. At 10, I did my usual routine. I brushed my teeth, changed into my pajamas, and listened to music for half an hour or so before turning over and going to sleep. As I expected, I woke up again in the middle of the night. This time, I was too afraid to move, too afraid to open my eyes and see what could be lurking in my room. Instead, I kept them tightly shut and tried desperately to go back to sleep. After laying in bed for what felt like hours, but must have only been 20 minutes, I decided to open my eyes. I was filled with a directionless dread as I slowly peeped out over my duvet. Since I had woken up, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. And as I pulled the covers away from my face, I saw who had been staring at me. My bedroom door was wide open, and sitting perfectly still in the doorway was Buster. His head was craned slightly and looking directly at me. I chuckled to myself, realizing that I had been terrified over nothing. I swung my legs out of bed and got up. I took Buster by the collar and began to lead him back downstairs to his bed. As I walked down the hall, I noticed that the door to my sister's room was ajar. I brought Buster into the kitchen and watched as he laid down on the crumpled mess of cardboard and old blankets that he slept on. I smiled as he slumped his head onto his paws and closed his dreary eyes. I wouldn't exactly call him my best friend, but I'd miss him after tomorrow. I turned to leave, to crawl back into bed and finally get some rest, but something caught my eye from out of the kitchen window. I leaned against the sill and looked out into the cold night. The moon was a perfect crescent, half hidden by the clouds. Light pollution from the nearby city robbed the sky of stars, but I stared out into the darkness, and I caught a glimpse of a shooting star. As I gazed in awe to see if there would be another one, I saw someone. There was a person leaning against the fence along our front driveway. I quickly realized it was Emily. I couldn't make much out in the darkness, but I could see that she looked nervous. I was about to open the window and call out to her when I heard something behind me. I turned around and realized it was coming from the dog. I assumed he had yelped in his sleep, maybe stuck in some bad dream. But then I noticed something else. His skin was moving. Rather, there was something moving around just under the surface of his skin. I didn't have time to think what it could be before I saw the long, crimson-red fingers protrude from his stomach. They grabbed onto either side of the now gaping wound and parted his abdomen like curtains. Once the opening was wide enough, the unnaturally long arm reached out, snaking across the kitchen floor until it grabbed the dining table's leg. It held onto it tightly as it began to pull the rest of it out. I couldn't comprehend how something so large could have fit inside of that animalistic facade. Eventually, it was fully out and stood upright. The figure must have been at least 3 meters tall. It was hunched over where it met the ceiling. It looked like it had been skinned, its lanky body made up of exposed sinew and muscle. The thing's eyes were milk white and bulging out of its vaguely dog-shaped head. It was grotesque. With a streak of urine running down my leg, I turned around and ran as fast as I could upstairs. I burst into my parents' bedroom and stood in front of their bed, screaming and wailing about some monster. They were both shaken awake at my outpour of terror. My father was calm at first. He tried to sit me down and tell me that it had all been a bad dream like the night before. I pushed him away and tried to articulate between screams that there was a monster downstairs and we had to leave. My father quickly became furious. His anger at me was only amplified by his tiredness. He grabbed my shaking hand and began to shout that at 14 I was too old for this, for any of this. But I was hysterical, and his attempt at reasoning did nothing. As I kept on wailing, he and my mother began to half lead, half drag me back to my own room. Kicking and screaming, I fell onto my bedroom floor. I jolted at the noise of the slamming door and got to my feet. With tears streaming down my red cheeks, I pounded the door. I heard my father's voice on the other side pleading with me to calm down. Our shouting reached a fever pitch, and then silence. We both stopped and listened out of the repetition of the noise that had brought our heated argument to an end. The dull, thudding noise came again, this time accompanied by a shrill creak. I realized it was the sound of something, climbing the stairs. I took a tentative step back as the noise drew closer and closer. In a weak voice, I heard my father stutter. What? What are you?" I knew what he had seen. I've spent the last 11 years blocking out the memory of what came next. There was screaming and pleading, the sound of flesh ripping and bone shattering. I sat motionless on the carpet of my bedroom floor as viscous blood began seeping in from under the door. The sounds of carnage stopped, and I held my breath as there was perfect silence once again. This silence was broken by the sound of my door slowly creaking open. I was petrified with fear. I couldn't do anything, couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. The thing opened my door a crack before stopping. The slowly thudding noise returned as it walked away from the scene until I couldn't hear anything anymore. I stayed welded to the spot for a minute or two before grief hit me like a bus. I began crying until my eyes were raw. I stood up and took my phone from the bedside cabinet. I dialed 911 and desperately tried to explain what had happened. I glanced out of my window and my jaw went slack. Walking down the middle of our street was the creature, caked in blood, the same shade as its taunt skin. Holding its hand and walking next to it was Emily. She stared up at it with affection. The two were illuminated by the street lights, and I saw that the creature was holding the fursuit that it had once been Buster in the talons of its other hand. I watched as they walked down the street, across the sidewalk, and into the forest that surrounded my neighborhood. That was the last time I saw my sister. Within the hour, the police came. They cordoned off the area and took me in. I spent the next few years in foster care. The official statement they had given was that it was a kidnapping gone wrong. Only I and the officers and the coroner who saw my parents' remains knew that it was something much more sinister. That was 11 years ago. Tonight, I finish writing this before I begin a journey that I should have undertaken a long, long time ago. Emily is still out there, somewhere, and I am going to find her.